I think I'm going to give another one of these little histories that you do not have to take necessarily literally, or you do not have to take it totally metaphorically. And I must admit, I have no great plan in mind. I did not draw up charts, and I was going to divide up the kinds of people who are normally attracted to this in a sort of a short parallel comparative history. And it's not really gossip, and it's not really any sort of inside information about other people, because somewhere within the general groups I was going to pull out of my head, all of you will find yourself in there somewhere, and it has to do with the way people are wired up, what seems to attract them about this, where a lot of people, various people stop, where many people, as far as they can tell, change aim in the middle of the flight of the arrow, and a whole bunch of other stuff, and something about possibly this year's winter crop from Southern California. So I did not make any great plan. I hadn't broken it down into ready to draw up charts and tell you that there are 12 major groups of people who are attracted to such as this, and I've named them this and that. I will be writing what I'm about to say, as always, several seconds before you hear it. So it's not, like I said, it's not limited to just what I was going to say. One thing to remember, again, for this to be of most apparent practical significance or validity, is consider again a man and consider his little brain and our all-time level of consciousness. I should be saying, as a matter of fact, level of mental consciousness, but you know what I mean, because the body has its own consciousness. Man is not just conscious, unless we're going to be real technical about the use of consciousness, which I normally am, but the body has its own awareness. The body certainly is alive, and as always, to remind you that division is verbally arbitrary, but it has some validity to it nonetheless. By the time, as psychologists would say, that a child's motor skills are generally in place, the time you get to preschool, your body is about as conscious as it's going to be. Now, those who are wired up along athletic lines, let us say, or those who end up in labor-intense physical occupations, your body may become a bit more conscious, but it's not anything that's going to change the shape of your destiny. That is, by the time you're 5 or 6, consider that your intellect at that time is minimal. But your body becomes as conscious, generally speaking, as it's going to become, assuming that you're genetically all right and you're not crippled. Anything beyond that, athletics would be a prime example, that you're wired up in such a way that you undertake to develop your muscles or your running skills or high jump, or you play football. And so you can say the body becomes a bit more conscious with someone deeply involved with athletics than the ordinary person. It does not change the general shape of what they are. So for all intents and purposes, by the time you're 5 or 6 years old, your body is as conscious as it's going to be. It can eat, it can look after itself. You're then grown consciously at the physical level. It is then, and this of course always is overlapping, but it is sort of then that the intellect takes off and begins to try and mature itself. And that's, if you notice, humanity has worked it out, at least in the Western world, or the civilized world, that about the time that the body has reached its general state of consciousness is at the same time that you push the little nippers off to school. It just makes sense. It just seems right that they're at the point that they can stand upright and they can go to the bathroom unaided and they can walk to school and generally look after themselves as well as a little toddler can. But it's about that same time, it is then, with no particular planning on human's part, individual's part, they ship him off and say, now it's time to go to school. No one ever seemed to notice why they came up with that age. It just seemed right. But as the body has about reached its extent of consciousness, then the intellect starts, the mind. And I was going to give like I said, my own little made up as I go along breakdown, because it has to do with the kind of divisions of people, types of people I was going to describe. It has to do with the way that they're wired up down in the body and the nervous system, as always, and then it expands, expounds, exposes itself through the intellect. But I was going to point out tonight, use it in a specific way, the sorts of people who believe that they become interested in things mystical, the occult, the supernatural, the spiritual, the religious in the widest sense of the word. And I'm going to speak pretty generally, of course, except when I speak specifically. Now I'll be not speaking all that generally, as you might note. Yes, that was it. At some age, let's say that everyone who becomes interested in matters of physical, that they start off with at a general level. They start off in a general area within the wiring system, that their intellect, and I do not use intellect right now having to do with any sense of educated sophistication. It is just that some children, some humans, but as a child, most children are more interested in going out and playing than they are in studying. I know that may come as a shock, but we all know that. But there is a general level that those who would undertake, or those who display some interest in things mystical, that they very early have an interest in intellect. Whether they do well in school or not, so not the point. But they began, you might say, ordinary people, daydream a lot. They live more in the mind at an early age than some of their contemporaries in the neighborhood do, who are always out playing ball. They may still play ball, but they have a more intense personal interest in the intellect. What's beginning to go on in their head of greater interest than most of the other kids around them. So we move on up a while, and let's say we're hitting somewhere in puberty. And I've already drug out this kind of examples many times of would-be mystics at an early age beginning to ask the unanswerable questions. So we've already been through that, but let's push it on a little bit, at least in the mid-teens or late teens. And there's some general categories of the way people are wired up, and they're easy to see, and they're fairly easy for me to describe. It's just according to how many I decide to describe. Probably 3 or 4 or 5 will be sufficient, that within one or more you will find that you have tried, or that you have some sympathetic reaction, some understanding of these kinds of people. And their proliferation ebbs and wanes with the passing of time, but they still overlap in the same way that just because it's after 5 o'clock here in Atlanta when we're doing this, it doesn't mean that 5 o'clock p.m. is gone in Los Angeles. They still both exist, that sort of thing. The kinds of people who become interested in things mystical. One of the major areas are domineering people. And it shows itself, I'm going to put descriptions on it that'll make sense whether anyone's ever thought about it this way. Not just domination of other people. That's almost another category. But it's people, it's children. Let's say we're talking about teen years or even early 20s, but it would already been fairly active within the person's field of interest in what they think about, what they were reading about, the things that they tried to discuss with others, whether they found much interest in their contemporaries or not. But they were already staggering around looking for, they were interested in things mystical. Now the kinds I'm talking about, this first group that has always been with us, in times past would have normally been referred to probably as witch doctors, shamans, and an easy explanation, which is not complete, but it's a point in the right direction. They feel impotent in the face of growing up. Now I'm going to start using some real quick psychological terms, but you know that I don't mean them seriously at all, and I'm just using the kinds of things to give you a shortcut for your mind to go ahead and follow it along. in one sense, all children feel impotent in the same way all young dogs and wolves feel impotent growing up around the others. You look to someone else for direction. But now we could be speaking of someone, a man or a woman, 20 years old, and they are physically independent, let us say, that they're no longer dependent upon the herd or their family to look after themselves. But they are not independent mentally. And we're still talking about now the specific groups of people who find themselves interested in the so-called mystical life or the mystical way. Well, everyone feels impotent mentally. It's why we have education. You feel, and those who are interested in things mystical, things beyond the ordinary pale, really feel impotent because they at first go through the kinds of things I've described already. They try to ask questions, they try to find books, they ask, what's the purpose of life, where do we come from, where are we going, and no one knows. Now that will give you, assuming you've got a real interest, not just a passing, blabbering interest that some kid or some teenager might make, but that you really pursued it, that it seemed to be of great interest to you personally, and you find out that no one knows. Then you're faced with a kind of feeling of impotency. And if it was in cruder circumstances than ours today, let us say, they would feel it as being an impotence in the face of nature. If it makes it easier, if we were to back up hundreds of years ago, or to one or two areas probably still on this planet today, more tribal settings, people at the back front, at the foreback of civilization. There were some people right now on some South Pacific island or somewhere that are just relatively late out of the Stone Age and that sort of thing. They feel impotent in the face of nature, as they should, as everyone does at some age. Impotent over the fact that they cannot control the rainfall, they cannot control the change of seasons, they cannot control whether typhoons hit them and wipe out their crops. It is simply the old story of being, the closer you are to nature, the more that they're inclined to look upon nature in a supernatural way. That if you're living a substance existence, that you're having to scratch every day to stay alive, then you feel somewhat impotent in the face of simply what we would call nature. That is where you find the origins of those who become witch doctors or shamans. And there's always exercises in that group a kind of political power. But they start off on the basis of trying to find some way to do black magic, or even white magic, whatever you want to call it. That is, they look upon in a less civilized era and area, and you went through one yourself. So we're not just talking about theoretical tribespeople of hundreds of thousands of years ago, or even someone on another part of the planet right now, because you went through the same stage, always remember. But you would have the person not looking upon the other tribesmen around. They probably had already tried to talk to their father or mother about why do the winds blow sometime and wipe out all our crops and all of us die? Who's got it in for us? Why does it rain sometimes non-stop for 2 months and ruin all of our crops, and then the next year it doesn't rain for 10 months straight and it dries everything up? And nobody knows. And they'll have some sort of story, well, the gods seem to frown upon us some years, and they may pray to the wind, they may pray to the sun. So here's our 20-year-old would-be mystic under those conditions. He does not see any battle between him and society. He doesn't see, because their society is too unstable, it is too nebulous to start with, they're just living hand to mouth. He does not see it as an assault or a struggle between him and the prevailing philosophy of the tribe or the prevailing political view, because the closer you are to living at starvation, at that starvation level, of course, the less there is any organized society. It's just a matter of trade-off, and it's all a matter of the relative position of where the people are. At any rate, he does not end up, that kind of mystic, he does not end up trying to reform their prevailing religion. He does not end up trying to counteract or give an alternate paradigm for their political system. He will end up being exactly what a shaman was originally described as, or a witch doctor. He seems to be the one, as far as the tribe's concerned, and the way he looks at it is, he is in some sort of mortal spiritual combat with nature itself, with the elements. Well, who else has he got? Evil to them is starvation. Evil to them is too much rain when they've had enough, or evil is not enough rain when they hadn't had enough. So they don't need theology. They do not need speculative pictures of demons and archangels that try to overthrow God up in the heaven. They're dealing with everyday evils about to get them. That is death, the starvation of their family and children. So that kind of mystic ends up feeling as though he is trying to do some sort of battle, that he is a mystical knight, but he's not off charging after some other theory, some secret. It is him against nature. But it always, on that basis, the closer it is to that level, it always carries with it very distinct political overtones, because he will become, if not the chief of the tribe, if they have a chief, if they have an alpha wolf running the tribe at that level, the witch doctor is going to be his main adversary. He's going to be, in some cases, if it gets too big, he will become his nemesis, and they may begin to combat themselves. And you can see that in the Western world, especially the Middle Ages, the battle between all the growing kingdoms and royal families of Europe and the church. After the fact now, or even then, people try to look at it as some kind of battle between the world of the Spirit and the world of God, and it wasn't. It was the king's understanding that the Pope was their competition. It was strictly a power struggle, but ordinary people can't see that. But I just want to show you there's nothing new with that. But in some instances, the shaman of the tribe will be de facto the chief, if not entitled also. That he is the one that they turn to, not for just protection from other tribes, but in this case, they have a chief and a shaman. They look to him for protection from those things that are non-human. The wrath of the gods, if the winds are the gods, or the rains, or the sun. Another type you have are the real fearful. We've got a 20-year-old. Back in that kind of tribe, where we've got a 20-year-old in high school or college here in the 20th century. And he has already, or she has already been pursuing occult, New Age, mystical, metaphysical, philosophical books for years and years and years, and stumbling around. But they are of such a fearful type that they are the strictly follower, strictly submissive wolf type in a pack situation. And it normally will spring into at least two branches, one of them being the normal priesthood outside the feral level of a tribal situation, such as I just mentioned, but turn into the priesthood and or pursue charitable activity. They are fearful, and it can turn in, what turns them into those two types, is it can turn into just such a fear that they become either, they seek the priesthood, or else they seek shelter under the priesthood. That they're the ones, that is the most clearly identifiable basis for the belief that men have in a personal God. And by personal God, I mean that people believe that there is another figure, another force outside of humans that can look upon, and does look upon, each person individually, including the person that believes it especially. Because that is at the heart of their belief. They could not sustain the belief, that would not carry them through, if in some way somebody could prove that, if they say, well, maybe there is a God. But even if there is, he doesn't have time to look at you. It has to be the feeling that there is a personal God. That is, in the sense that this figure, this other power, this supernatural power, will take and does take specific note of individuals and what they do, and will comfort them, will give some attention to their pleas, that they are taken into personal consideration. If they have a bit of aggression, they will seek out the priesthood. Not as strongly as I was inferring under a less civilized condition of a shaman. A variation of that, as I was going to say, are those who feel the real weight of the world upon their shoulders. That they may at a very early age, and everyone goes through a certain stage of this. It may only last 2 or 3 seconds with you, or 10 minutes, all told. But it is the stage of a child, his dog dies, or his mother dies if he's old enough. He's confronted with that sort of thing, or somebody in the family dies, that maybe it doesn't crush him that much. Maybe it's a distant relative, But the family goes into such grief, it puts in such a shock around him that he begins to understand that you can look upon the story of Buddha as being a metaphor for that he was protected from that for years and years, supposedly by a father who had a suspicion that might do him no good. Since he had to be a prince, he didn't have to be exposed to that, and he suddenly was at an adult age, and as we say in the mystical business, it blew his gaskets. But it is to look upon the world as being one with a certain amount, if not a lot, but at least a certain amount of suffering. And you can find children nowadays, or you can always find them, but it's getting a little early, but puberty, teens at least, that you can find children that are saying that they want to devote their life to helping lepers, if we still had lepers, or helping the starving children in such and such place, or bringing world peace. And it's easy to make fun of and say some 13 or 14-year-old kid, but there are a sizable segment of people that feel so put upon by life, once not physically, but you understand there is but one physical how should we put it, discomfort. I think it's known as death around here. But everything else springs from that. But once it gets into the intellect, then they look around and they see or read about people starving, or they may take up social causes. They may take up causes for justice. Wherever they are, they may try to identify with some minority group that they feel is being persecuted or has not received equitable treatment. It is simply, you should know what I mean, it is one has in passing. You don't become depressed over it, but that kind of feeling, the weight can be something you ate, you could be getting a bug, but it can be tied into the fact that you're switched on TV and you might watch the news every night and you see children starving to death all over some area of the world, and you see it night after night. But sometimes, like I said, it can be just a bug you're getting. You're tired yourself, and suddenly you look at that and you can sit there and cry. And you may not have done it since you were a teenager, but there are people who are interested in the mystical path. Remember, we're still talking about that. I'm not talking about humanities in general. That they stop there. Their interest in finding out what was going on in life then becomes completely covered over by the fact that, well, life is just suffering. Buddha had it right. Or all the prophets had it right. Life is just some way the forces of evil have got the upper hand here on earth, and it's horrible. And they give up any sort of struggle, even if they had no clear definition of what it was or any clear notion. But they give up any notion, they give up any drive to understand life. They simply stop at the place that life seems to be more or less bad news. I mean, people are suffering. As always, the point is people are dying. But 90 years old and they're off at home and you don't see them, but when you find out somebody 12 killed a day, or when you find out that children 2 and 3 years old, just barely born, are in some area of the world, or someone dies real close to you, or you find out your mother's dying of cancer. It is this thing that will just life is just really, it's got to be, it's either torture. We're either in hell now as a thing, or else this is some transit station through which we must pass, and they end up with a feeling that I should be helping others, or at least be concerned over it, and they never get past that point. And somewhere within there, they normally do become good followers of something, some idea, some religion, some charitable undertaking. But they stop there. And it is quite understandable, as hard-nosed as verbally I may sound at times, everyone feels some sort of suffering about life that you, even if it is just personally, it doesn't show that you're selfish, but you had to have suffered if your mother or father or good friend or brother or sisters died or is deathly ill now, even if you may not have any widespread charitable feel for the rest of the world. It simply strikes you. It is part of the nervous system nexus between all people, and the closer you are genetically, the more likely it will strike you. But very likely all of you have had some piece at one time of just almost feeling like we're just going to fall down the floor and maybe cry indefinitely over the fact of seeing these children starve and starve and starve and starve and nothing's going on. That's just probably the worst example I can think of. And you just think, well, it's just horrible, and how can I worry about people just stop there? People who start out on the mystical path, and they may end up becoming a field worker. They may end up out working amongst the sick and the poor and the hungry. Or they may just, as I said, end up as a passive follower of some group that professes to have a great interest in that. Of course, all the major religions do, at least in the West. And most of them, one of their excuses for collecting money consistently is to spread the wealth out in the world, to help the hungry and the downtrodden, and etc. And so if these people do not actively become involved in trying to alleviate the feeling they feel of this weight, this sorrow, then at least they will become a passive, they'll become a follower of something and may contribute money to it. There's another group that, let's go back to my high school, fairly contemporary times. They're kind of quirky people, outsiders. They weren't necessarily criminally or dangerously deranged and unusual in high school, but they were not the sort, if you went back to a high school reunion 10 years later, if you're showing someone your book, it's the kind of guy that never joined anything. And he always kind of looked funny. He was the first guy to dye his hair green when everybody else had purple hair. And then when everybody let it grow out, he cut his off. The kind of outsider guy. Now, not all of them, of course, as any of my other groups, end up pursuing a mystical interest. But many of them, some of them, will be interested in things unusual. And if I were going to really lay on the psychological descriptions, and we could say that they feel so alienated from the mainstream. They do not seem to fit into any of the major cliques in high school. That they're the kinds that might take up listening to Ozzy Osbourne or Black Sabbath, or try to get involved, figure out that there is some kind of reality to Satan worship, as it's being called in the Western world now, which is sort of a minor offshoot of my first example of the shaman, but of people who do not fit in socially. They're uncomfortable, they don't have enough talent, they don't play football, they can't sing well enough. They're just always at the periphery of all the good times, just the mainstream of life. And some of those people, and when I said I could lay on the psychological interest, I don't mean it's just that causes it. But I just wanted you to understand the kinds of people I'm talking about, because it might apply to some of you, and you might try to look off and go, well, I wonder who he's talking about. So that's the reason I stopped, to make it a little more, or bring it out a little more in stark relief. These people, by the way, very often make the news in later life, because in the Western world, they're normally, as far as those who end up or who have an interest in things mystical at one time, they're the ones you normally see coming to usually some sorry or nefarious end as a cult leader. You do not find cult leaders in other parts of the world, by the way. It's a different circumstance, but they can end up being the young Turks and hotheads of the fundamentalist aspect of their prevailing religion. That we're going through a period of that right now, for those of you that know what anyway. But they will become very often the kinds of guys you see that end up, leading mass suicides, or getting in shootouts with the government, or doing something that seems to come to a bad end. And if you've never noticed, nowadays, of course, we've got video everywhere, and so you can at least see some backup where you see his high school prom dance, or maybe some home videos they made. And any of these guys, if you look at them, if you got any sense at all, if you look at them, you do not imagine them as the head of the football team. You do not imagine them as, if they played in the band, it was probably the tuba or the bass drum, something that the school furnished. They probably had to take away his mouthpiece if he was playing the tuba and just let him mark. At any rate, you could look at him and you realize that he was not part of the mainstream of the social life of his high school. He just, it looks a little weird. You can just look at a still picture of him at 17 and it makes sense. Or you look at him as his final days of glory when he's going out to whatever he did. It is a kind of, it is a form of domination, but it is, the only reason I bring it up, it is slightly askew from just the domination, the desire to overcome and to run others that I was going to get into as sort of a wrap-up. that it's a little different from the shaman under less civilized and sophisticated conditions. Then there's the general one of just seeking dominance. That again is not how they started out. We'll give them all credit that they all started out with, they're wired up in such a way as they have that great mystical urge, going through all the many things I've described before of asking what's going on if nobody knows, and they read books, they listen to best they can, they try all kinds of dope and alcohol, they try everything. But we're to the point of all these groups I'm discussing, they get to a place, and in a sense they give up. They reach as their level of satisfaction. They reach their level of exhaustion. They reach their level that life finally beats them down. Life finally turns out their lights, punches them off. They simply stop. They calm down. For those of you that, there was a surprising amount of reaction the other night to that news item. It said as the pages turned, which was supposed to be a calendar, as the pages dropped, that's what it said, and the hands turned like on a clock, one guy announced, "No, I will not calm down. Not as long as I'm alive." I didn't bother to point out that that was not your normal citizen speaking. But that is right at the heart of me trying to describe that people finally give up, get satisfied, get exhausted. But the general umbrella I was going to describe of at least two of those groups, the people who have that sort of interest, but it's also tied in with a kind of aggression and a kind of normal aggression. I'm not talking about anything psychotic from an ordinary view. It is the same kind of aggression, the same kind of dominant genetic wiring as makes one wolf finally take over a wolf pack, that makes one gorilla take over a gorilla family, pack, herd, law office,
No.
city council. That is what you see as being the fire, as it used to be called, the fire and brimstone preachers in the West, is what you see as the fundamentalists, as they're now called in the other religions, of Buddhism, Islam, Judaism. They're the ones who are seen as being politically conservative, as those which amounts to always looking at the past and always looking at man as being still a used car, that he is not in any state of grace, he is not in any state to be trusted, and we have therefore collectively got to keep our hands, if not our shackles, collectively on each other, or everything's going to fall apart. Now that all sounds nice, and it can be defended on a widespread level. It can be defended with some reasonable intelligence at a collective political level. But those who do it have no interest in that. All they want to do is be in charge. The whole idea of the madmen, as they're called, of history, the tyrants who will take over in some coup and abolish, oust a weak king, the royal family. And they say, well, I'm doing it on the basis the king or queen has become so weak, the streets are unsafe, it's no story. Our currency is going downhill, but it's usually a matter that our streets are unsafe. And civilization's falling apart, and by God, I didn't want this job. All I am was just a general. I was satisfied running the army. But I cannot see my country, my great country, fall to pieces simply for the lack of leadership. So, hell, I didn't ask for it. But I'm going to do it. I'll sacrifice. Don't thank me. I'm going to take over and straighten things out. I'll make the streets safe. He put himself in charge. I mean, it's no great secret. People still debate it. But when you see how plain such as that is, and you realize that people, serious people, educated people, still debate this. Debate it seriously. People win Pulitzer Prizes over books debating this, when it was obvious to a lowly wolf 6,000 years ago, to a lowly Sumerian. Everybody knew. The guy says, well, you know me, I'm Org, and I've decided I'm going to take over the hill here, or I'm going to take over the tribe. I didn't want it. I just living in peace, as you guys know, but things are falling apart here, so I'm going to take charge for everybody's benefit until we can get things straightened out. I mean, it's just absolute bullshit. He took over because he wanted to be in charge. And everybody knows that. Because as soon as a tyrant takes over, the streets may get safe, but it's just safe for his men to go out and loot. It's just safe for him. It is simply the nature, it is back below the level of mental consciousness. It's where it is. But those who started out with some interest in the metaphysical, which is, relatively speaking, at the high end of that which is above the level of mental consciousness, very many of them will end up right back at the level which is almost as low as you can sink back, and that is being a fundamentalist, being what amounts to a political priest, amounts to being an Attila the Pope. It amounts to, if they're not doing it nowadays, of course it's very difficult to do that physically in most of the world. To physically run a dictatorship, it's becoming so harder and harder job and occupation to come by. And so what they're doing is an expansion of what it's why I called him a Attila the Pope, or a priest soldier, priest alpha wolf, is now the domination is more and more here, because life is simply not arranged for someone to take over most of the Western world and increasing areas of the Eastern world. Just the whole planet is becoming unsuitable, at least for this time, for tyranny, physical, political. And so what you have is an expansion of the tyranny, the would-be dictatorship, but the authoritarianism above the level of consciousness. It is still part of the increasing importance of the world of ideas. I know nowadays it's called the world of information, but it's the world of ideas as opposed to the physical world. That now there's more money and information and data almost than there is in gold mines. It's just the way that life has gone. That the man is now more and more driven by this. So now those that stopped at that place, the domination has to be in thought. That you have less and less, although they do try to do it. With the Pope, to take one example, the Catholic Church does tell people under what conditions they should have sex, which is about as physical as you can get. Judaism and still keeps up in Islam. They dictate there are certain things that you should not eat, that it's immoral, it's unholy, that they're still doing that, and they still try and hold or try to wield a certain kind of literal power. If they were tortured, they will of course say they're just repeating the word, they're just trying to follow the dictates of God as set out right here in the Quran or the Old Testament, and they say that they're simply serving a higher power. But it is less and less a reality that any group of people or one man to start off his own little religion or his own little mystical cult, mystical group, to exercise physical control. Now this is not to say that there are not those who delight in it and that he would not come up with some group of people. And they're still going on, of course. But when it starts to make it expand for any little mystical leader to amount to anything, he has to exercise increasing amounts of control over the mind, over what they think, over what they say, than just how they operate, how they behave. It is then, that's the general group. Shamans fall into that to varying degrees. Those who would do charitable work, those who are simply passive followers of some religion, those who want to worship, which is an offshoot I didn't mention of feeling the sorrow of the world, is that feeling that I do so want to worship. It is a feeling of helplessness. It is sort of between the shaman trying to take over, trying to go do head-to-head combat with the nature, with the elements. Look at that as being one end. The other end is those who just feel the burdens of life, that life is helpless. We will be rained out. We could starve to death next year. Life is just hopeless. And sort of in between there are those that feel the need to worship. That they feel that I'm helpless. There's nothing I can do. Life is too big. The fate is too much for me. But it's a feeling of, if I just had somebody to pray to, if I just knew that somebody was there, even if they won't help me right this second, it's just knowing that there's somebody I can appeal to, some higher force. I can make it, probably get a laugh, and I don't intend it for that reason, but at least know there's somewhere they can go complain, that they can whine. That does not seem to be a total act of futility. Well, we can't stand and debate it, because you can say, well, it is futile, but they're in the midst, if they're part of some group or some religion or wherever they are, in the midst of some civilized group, they will have some form of religion, and therefore they are in good company to appeal to some other force, or at least to whine, to say, dear God, dear Allah, do you know that my whole family's starving? My wife died. I'm trying to raise the children. I can't get anything to grow. Are you aware of it? Would you please help? And even if it doesn't help, it does serve some purpose. Now, you make a mistake to laugh at prayer, to laugh at religious people. It is serving a purpose. Life knows what it's doing. In fact, prayer is, from certain views, as infantile or silly as it can seem. In many cases, prayer, if you never thought about it, is about as close as most people ever get to, in a momentary fashion, to anything resembling intentional direction of their mind. And it usually takes, of course, for people to pray unusually unpleasant circumstances. It takes something out of the norm to bring them to it, that my life is falling apart, or I may be dying. You know, dear God, would you help? And they do whatever the procedure is, go on your knees or perform some ritual, and believe that you're talking to the actual life force. And I don't mean to exaggerate this, but with many people, that will be the only time in their life that they have anything going on neurologically that resembles in any way an actual willful direction of their consciousness. But it's almost always a last-ditch stand. Just, I don't know what else to do. Dear God, please help. At any rate. I'm going to let that go for the groups of people, because somewhere in several of those, or all of those, all of you have tried. It all ends up with this. Well, one more. Those that may end up actually involved, again, it's as a follower, that believes that there is some secret knowledge. Let's say that all the ones I just mentioned, that they survived that. They saw parts of that, they had little touches of it, but then they believed that they had located some still living remnants of a real mystical school, monastery, group. And let us say that they arrange their life, that they actually go and take up with it, that they go move in with some group, some commune, or some monastery, or some school, either in their local vicinity or on the other side of the world in an exotic culture. Do you realize that all of them, though, end up in a collective milieu? No one ever looks at it that way. They end up either trying to run some group of people, or they end up in a group of people being run. But the point is, it's not removed. Those that are interested in the mystical way, like I said, most people, if you ask them, just average people, what would you think about a mystic, or how would you describe a mystic? What comes to mind? And surely they would think of something out of a Walt Disney cartoon, or some drawing from the Middle Ages of a guy with a pointed hat and all kinds of symbols and a big old robe and funny-looking sticks and wands in his hands. And not that it has no validity, but I assure you that a real mystic doesn't look anything like that. Well, even when they started, the groups I just described, my breakdown of them, they all started out, they all went to high school, they all had bicycles, tricycles, they all had the measles, they all threw spitballs at girls, they all did everything. They all broke a bone, bruised a knee, had a dog, wanted to be a baseball player, wanted to be a football player, wanted to be a ballerina. They were just, but there was something else going up here. The point of me saying that is, up to a certain point, those who are interested in the mystical life are not that extreme. They're not that unusual vis-a-vis the mainstream, because they were in high school with you. Jesus went to high school somewhere, in some form. Buddha did. They were out there. Everybody, when they heard about him later, they had friends that went with Jesus. I used to play stickball with him. Of course, they usually go, I always thought something was a little, unusual, but, is that the same Buddha that used to live down on 42nd and Essex? Well, I used to play stickball. Are you sure that's him? They were not that different. They could not have been, by the way. The idea that mystics are in some way strange, you're talking about some way to be genetically flawed. And mysticism and genetic flaws being, beyond your control anyway, but I assure you, they are not compatible. The Buddhas and the Jesus and the Laos and the Abrahams, they were just about as square up to a certain point, and every day as anybody could be up to a certain point. But back to what I was pointing out to you, from a far range of everything I described, from potential madmen, cult leaders, to just passive people who believe that the whole world is just caved in on them, there's nothing to do but just get through this and whine and perhaps pray and hope for the best. And they all started out. That's why I said, let's assume that means that all the people I described, no matter how they end up, they all started out on somewhat of an equal footing. They all started out looking for that mystical path, and let's say that they all were more or less the same at one point. Now, all the ones I mentioned have something else in common. Years down the road, all those groups, they end up in a collective environment. And I was trying to give you to exaggerate it, to get you to where I'm going to eventually point. The last group I mentioned, those that do not end up being some kind of self-appointed sham leader, not know what they're doing, all they want to do is have some group of people to play sycophant with them and yes man and bow to them, or for those that just wring their hands and give up and become a follower of some either madman or just some fairly innocuous group. They become religious in a passive sense. All of those, relative to all of those, I was going to say, look at for the sake of what I'm about to point out, relatively speaking, my last group would be in a better position. In other words, they did not give completely up. They did, and they didn't, after realizing that no one seemed to know anything, they didn't decide to appoint themselves a leader, to at least be in charge. If I'm going to be around other idiots, at least I'm going to be the head idiot. Or they didn't get so beaten down by life and they become so depressed that they just become a professional depressed person and put on black and become a 60-year-old Catholic woman, even if you're a man. If they got through all that, they did not trapped by that, then let us say it's someone who does go off and they pursue, not some maniac, they may start pursuing a guru here and there, that is, it's someone that seems to be running some splinter mystical group, but they by and large will end up somewhere close to, if there was such a thing as mainstream mysticism. For instance, they would very likely end up close to, these are ones to describe, would be some form of Zen Buddhism. It might be some man in New York City, an American born, and he may claim either to have studied in Japan or he may even admit nowadays, we've gone far enough, that he's never been to Japan, but he studied from another American who had been to Japan. Or he might be following some some Sufi school, which now covers a wide area. But it would be something that would seem to have some sequential connection to mainstream mysticism. That is, as opposed to some cult leader, some one-man crusade, some one-man idiot somewhere, some nutcase. So they go off and they actually try and devote a large part of their life, whether they can actually go to a monastery or not, but they may go move to wherever they feel like this activity is going on at its best, and they may still have to hold down a job, and everybody involved with it may have to. But the rest of their life, outside their working day, almost the rest of their life, seems to be devoted to this. Now, relatively speaking, for the sake of what I'm going to conclude with, or to conclude tonight and then start some other time, but relatively speaking, just picture that, relatively speaking, they're better off than the first groups of people I mentioned. But even this last group still has in common with the rest of them, they are in a collective environment. And I could stand here and bring up the positive attributes of that. I could say that everyone must go through some of that. But I want to bring now back your attention to the fact that the mystical path with everyone is so narrow that only one mind can walk it. There is no such thing as a collective mystical effort. There is no such thing as a community awakening. There's no such thing as communal enlightenment. The experience itself only comes about when you can develop what amounts to your own individual voice. And by voice, I'm talking about now your consciousness, because that's what a man's voice is. When it gets to the mystical level, it's not your speaking voice. Your voice is the thing that drives, ultimately, your voice, which is where the energy of life, the energy that comes through this planet, runs up your nervous system and culminates in the individual, in humanity, at the brain. Until you see that everything that normally takes place in you at that level has been, the easy way to put it is to say a product of collective thought, and yet it's not. That's why I conjured up this picture for you of this world-encompassing thinking cloud. It is not that all of humans over the last 6,000 or 10,000 years have some way built up collective consciousness, or built up this, as I called it, a thinking cloud, or a thinking cache, a thinking bank somewhere, an idea bank. It's not that humans built this up. It's not what I'm talking about for the last few nights. That they have built it up, and now that you are in some way the product of it. That you are the product of 1,000 years. You could certainly say 6,000 years of physical evolution. Okay. But you missed the whole point. You will never, never be able to see anything if then you take that into the intellectual realm and believe that what you think, that what men are, what you are, but what we all are, individuals even, and collectively right now, circa 1995 on this planet, that we are the natural, organic product. We are the present outgrowth of 6 or 8 or 10,000 years of intellectual evolution. No such thing. Not in the sense that there was some progress in which man has contributed, which is why I said, as strange as it sounds, that cloud is not what men have contributed to, this bank of thinking. Thinking was already there. The ideas was already there. Man has not individually contributed to it. All you do is make temporary withdrawals every time you breathe and put it back in. But men nowhere put it in. They did not build this bank. I know that sounds absolutely impossible to any reasonable mind, but if you don't see the reality behind what I'm saying, you will never see what your mind is up to. You'll never see what consciousness is, and you cannot develop your own individual voice. Or to put it crudely, I don't mean to sound overly poetic, you'll never be able to be individually conscious, and you'll never know it. That's the great thing, if you'll accept my word of great. It's like people, if you say you're not conscious, if you tell somebody you're not as conscious as you could be. They go, well, yeah, I am. There you are. They told the truth. And as long as they accept that, they will never know otherwise. Until you see that everything that normally takes place in your mind, that's why I've been laying on it in several ways over the last few weeks or months, but especially the last few nights, that you do not have to do anything. Just get out of bed, walk around like another human. You don't have to give any attention. You mentally get through the day. You will intellectually get through 65 or 70 years of life, and it was just as automatic, as non-personal, as non-individualistic as you breathing. Because no one takes breathing personally. We all breathe the same air. You don't believe that you're personally in charge, that breathing is something that only you and perhaps another small handful of superior people do. Everybody does it. But people take their consciousness, they take what is running through here continually, they don't even analyze it. But if you bring up the subject, if you say something like, do you realize that people do not individually think? It's just like this huge thinking cloud just permeates everything, and people, it just runs through them, and they just do it. And any decent, civilized person, as they should, will immediately take supreme umbrage and refute that. But they never even think about it until it's brought up, and then they go, well, no, it can't be true. They'll say, well, just analyze what you said. It can't be true. Or it wouldn't be me saying this. I couldn't point it out, and etc. There's no way. But there is no such thing as another state of consciousness until you have something resembling an individual state, until you have an individual voice. That is, until you have some individual use of this. And as complicated as that seems to sound to people, or as sticky, as complex, it is not. Because all you've got to see is realize, to see it for yourself, that everything that you normally think, not do all these hand gestures, you don't have to do that, you just sit there. All you got to do is come to your momentary senses, just pay attention to what's going on in your mind, and you realize that thing runs 24 hours a day. It's made me famous, or it's made me infamous, it's made me rich, it's made me broke, it's carried me this far, and I have not contributed one thing to it. It was just there. And until you realize that, you cannot develop your own individual voice. But what I said, people seem to find it very complicated, like, well, what do you do about it? How do you go about it? The simplest way to look at it, the simplest way to start, is to simply realize that everything that normally takes place in you is not you. And you can see it. You can feel it. All you've got to do is stop thought. All you've got to do is interrupt thought. And it stops. If it was personal, in the same way that breathing or your heartbeat was, you would know it. It would have an effect. It would have an damaging effect, a negative effect. You stop this thought, and it has a liberating effect for the few people, for those rightly drawn to it. And you realize, Jesus, it's as though someone implanted a cheap 99-cent little pocket radio in my head, and it's been up there, and I thought that was me. I mean, that's easy to laugh at, but there are people, it takes them 50 or 60, well, I shouldn't give it, many decades to realize that. And they go, well, I knew that. Yeah. But they knew it selectively. They kept thinking, well, it's some kind of idea. Sometimes it's true that some of my thoughts are kind of noise and junky, but it's always karma, it's always a condition, it's always a way out. It's the mind protecting itself. They say, well, yeah, I know that some of what I do, oh, yeah, I'll be the first to admit, some of my thoughts and some of what goes through my mind is just, I'm sure is anything but mystical. Oh, yeah, it all is. And until you realize that, then you can separate from it. But you've got to be able to interfere with it. You've got to be able to suspend it continually. Plus all the other ways I've given you to look at, plus realize how hard it is, how seldom you can actually do it, and it doesn't really make a damn. That it's been 6 months since I actually did it. But look, in the last 6 months, I made $250,000 off that last deal, met 2 new girlfriends or boyfriends, bought a new car, went on 2 long trips, took up a new sport, learned to scuba dive, and I did all of that. Except, that's not true. I didn't do that. I wasn't even there. Not in the sense I'm there right now. That is the only way you can develop an individual voice. That is the only way that you can begin to individually, personally, see what's going on. And without that, there is no such thing, whether you ever reach enlightenment or not, whatever that is. I can't guarantee you. But I can guarantee this. You're not even going in the direction. You're doing nothing until you can interfere and suspend this. Because without this, you're not thinking. You're not an individual, which is why people strive so hard to look physically individualistic. That's why fashion, etc. Because up here, people don't analyze it, but there's no such thing as individuality. That's why we paint and dress up and have cars and have something to show that, hey, this is me. Because up here, people sort of know, this ain't me. I don't know what it is, but I ain't got time to think about it. I'm going to look at a new car. Did y'all get on? Okay.